Northern Maine, 1898. While every settler rushed to finish their cabins before winter, French-Canadian carpenter Jean Dubé was still building in late September. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Instead of stopping at a simple stoop, he framed a 6-foot-wide gallery wrapping his entire 18 by 24-foot cabin. Then he boarded it in, turning his home into what looked like a wooden fortress. Local sawmill hand Ephraim Cole couldn't believe the waste of lumber. Everyone knew the frontier rule: thicker walls and more chinking beat fancy carpentry outside. A porch can't warm a room. Then February 1899 arrived. The great Arctic outbreak swept down from Canada, driving temperatures below zero across Maine. Wind found every crack in standard cabins, turning doorways into chimneys of cold. Neighbor families watched their stoves lose the battle, bedrooms dropping to the 30s, water supplies freezing solid. But Dubé's cabin? 2 thermometers told the story. 22 degrees warmer inside when the mercury hit its lowest point. What did this French-Canadian builder understand about wind, insulation, and frontier survival that everyone else had dismissed as a waste of good timber? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Late August 1898 found Jean Dubé standing in the morning light, measuring timber with the methodical precision that marked every French-Canadian carpenter who had learned his trade in the Quebec parishes. The St. John River Valley stretched around him, thick with pine and maple, while his neighbors worked frantically to raise their cabins before the killing frost. Ephraim Cole had already chinked his logs and banked his foundation. Tom Ouellette was splitting shakes for his roof. Every settler in the valley followed the same frontier wisdom: build tight, build fast, and trust thick walls to hold the heat when winter came calling. But Dubé worked to a different rhythm. His cabin stood complete, 18 feet by 24 feet of heavy timber construction that drew from the French heritage buildings he had grown up around in northern Maine. 432 square feet of living space, efficient to heat, built with the kind of post and beam joinery that could stand for generations. Most men would have stopped there. Most men would have thrown up a simple stoop and called the work finished. Dubé picked up his measuring stick and began laying out something that made his neighbors shake their heads. He framed a 6-foot-wide gallery on all 4 sides of his cabin, not a narrow porch tucked against the front door, not a working platform for splitting wood or hanging game. A full gallery that would wrap his home like a wooden embrace, extending the roofline 30 feet by 36 feet when the work was done. 648 square feet of covered space surrounding his heated core, more than the cabin itself. Ephraim Cole watched from his own dooryard, arms crossed against his chest. "City veranda," he muttered to anyone who would listen. 6 feet of wasted roof. The local wisdom was simple and had kept frontier families alive for decades. Thicker walls and more chinking beat extra carpentry outside every time. Cole had seen men die trying to heat fancy houses. He had seen families burn through their winter wood by January because they built too big, too loose, too proud. A cabin needed to be tight, not pretty. Marie Dubé brought her husband coffee as he notched the gallery posts, her own understanding shaped by winters in Quebec, where galleries could run long and even wrap around the better houses. She had watched her mother stage firewood on covered platforms, had learned to think of wind as something that could be managed rather than simply endured. But even she wondered if John was taking the old knowledge too far. The neighbors were not wrong about waste. Lumber cost money, labor cost time, and time was running short. "Snow trap," called out Father Lefebvre as he walked the settlement road, his cassock black against the late summer green. The priest meant no harm, but he had seen enough frontier winters to know which preparations mattered and which ones killed families through misplaced effort. Extra roof meant extra weight when the snow came 3 feet deep. Extra posts meant more places for ice to build and timber to crack. The gallery looked impressive, but impressive did not keep children warm when the mercury dropped. Dubé set his posts on 8-foot centers, stout enough for snow load, and the drifted piles he would shovel from the main roof. He was not building storage. He was not building decoration. He was building an air buffer, a sacrificial layer where wind would die before it reached his cabin walls. The principle came from tambour construction, the windbreak entries common in Quebec architecture, but scaled up from protecting one doorway to protecting every wall. Tom Willette stopped his own work to watch Dubé Mortis and tend on his gallery frame with the same care most men reserved for their main structure. Waste of good timber, Ouellette said, and meant it. He could build 2 small cabins with the lumber Dubé was throwing into his fancy porch. Come spring, when the snow load cracked those extended rafters or the wind tore off those long roof sections, Dubé would learn the lesson every frontier builder learned eventually. Simple worked because simple lasted. The gallery took shape through September, a covered ring of dead space that made Dubé's solid cabin look small and lost in the center of too much carpentry. Neighbors walking the settlement road could not understand the mathematics. 432 square feet of heated living space, surrounded by 648 square feet of empty platform. It violated every rule of frontier efficiency. Heat came from wood. Wood came from labor. Labor was limited. Therefore, every square foot you heated had to justify itself in warmth, safety, and survival value. But Dubé worked with quiet confidence, his hands moving through mortise and tenon joints that his father had taught him, his eye measuring post spacing and rafter runs with the precision of a man who understood that winter did not forgive mistakes. When Marie asked him why he was building so much more than they needed, he paused in his work and looked at the completed gallery frame surrounding their home. "I am not building a porch," he told her, his words carrying the weight of knowledge learned in harder winters than these neighbors had seen. "I am building a place for the wind to get tired." The statement made no sense to anyone who heard it. Wind was wind. It blew where it wanted, when it wanted, with whatever force the weather brought down from Canada. A man could build thick walls to stop it, tight seams to block it, heavy doors to bar it from his home. But tiring the wind? Making it weak before it reached his walls? That sounded like the kind of thinking that got families killed when the real cold came calling. October would tell a different story. October brought the first serious frost to the St. John River Valley, and with it, the kind of bone-deep cold that reminded every settler why summer building mattered. The river skinned over with ice thin as window glass, and morning breath showed white in the still air. Jean Dubé stood on his completed gallery, watching his neighbors bank their foundations with sawdust and sod, making their final preparations for the long siege ahead. Most men considered their work finished. Dubé was just beginning the second half of his plan. He began nailing vertical planks around the entire perimeter of his gallery, turning the open platform into a complete enclosure. 132 feet of perimeter walls rising 7 feet high, built with the same vertical board construction he had learned for quick seasonal work in Quebec. The planks went up fast, 10-inch and 12-inch widths that shed ice better than horizontal lap siding when the work was temporary. Every seam got battens to control drafts, and he cut a proper door into the ring where it faced the settlement road. Ephraim Cole could not believe what he was seeing. "Man's boarded up his own house," he told Father Lefebvre as they watched Dubé work through the gray November afternoons. The gallery had looked foolish when it was open. Enclosed, it looked like madness. Cole counted the lumber going into Dubé's walls, 110 to 140 boards, depending on the widths, plus 20 to 30 pounds of cut nails to hold it all together. Enough material to build a decent shed, wasted on boxing in empty space. But Dubé worked with the steady confidence of a man following proven methods. He framed simple studs and diagonal bracing on the outside edge of the gallery, creating a structure that could handle snow load and wind pressure without transferring stress to the main cabin. The vertical planks went up in 3 long days of work after his regular chores, because winter schedules punished delay, and every frontier builder knew that November weather could turn killing cold without warning. Tom Willette walked the settlement road each evening, watching the enclosed gallery take shape with the fascination of a man seeing something completely outside his experience. The thing looked like a fort built around a house, Or maybe a barn constructed in the wrong place for the wrong purpose. "What's he planning to do in there?" Ouellette asked Marie Dubé when she came to the store for flour and salt pork. She only smiled and said her husband had his reasons, but even she wondered if Jean was taking the old Quebec methods too far, for frontier conditions. The ridicule peaked as Dubé finished the enclosure work. Father Lefebvre noted in his parish records that one family had built what appeared to be a second house around their first house, though he could not determine the purpose. Neighbors joked that Dubé had gotten confused and built his barn in the wrong location. Children dared each other to knock on the outer door, then run away when Marie appeared from what looked like a wooden tunnel leading to her actual home. But the first real blow of the season changed the conversation. November 15th brought wind that cut across the valley like a living blade, driving scattered snow and dropping the temperature 20 degrees between sunset and midnight. Dubé stepped from his cabin into the enclosed gallery and felt something that stopped him in his tracks. The wind sound dropped like someone had shut a barn door. The air inside the ring was still, not calm, but actually motionless, protected from the pressure that was hammering every other structure in the settlement. He had built an airlock on a massive scale. A tambour entry expanded from protecting one doorway to sheltering every wall of his home. The principle was simple enough that any frontier builder could understand it once demonstrated, but foreign enough that no one had thought to try it. Moving air stole heat by forcing warm air out through cracks and cold air in through gaps. Still air was insulation. The enclosed gallery killed wind pressure before it could reach the cabin logs, and created a buffer zone where temperatures stayed warmer than outside because the space was shielded from direct weather and borrowed a little heat through the inner walls. Marie discovered the practical benefits first. Wood splitting, boot scraping, tool sharpening, harness repair, all the daily work that normally dumped cold air into the main room every time she opened the door could now happen in the protected ring without affecting the interior temperature. The gallery became their winter workshop, a space that was not warm like indoors, but not bitter like the weather outside. She could spend an hour preparing kindling without numbing her fingers, could hang wet clothes where they would dry without freezing solid. Ephraim Cole noticed that Dubé's stove ran steadier through the windstorms, maintaining more consistent heat with what looked like less fuel. His own cabin fought a constant battle against drafts that found every gap in his chinking, every loose board in his door frame, every place where settling logs had opened new cracks. During blow weather, Cole's fire seemed to burn harder, but heat less, as if the wind was pulling warmth straight up his chimney and out through walls that felt solid but leaked air like a sieve. Tom Ouellette observed that the Dubé children coughed less during the raw November nights, when his own family huddled closer to their stove and still felt cold air creeping across the floor. The enclosed gallery was doing something that conventional frontier wisdom said was impossible. It was making the weather less harsh before the weather reached the heated space. The buffer zone absorbed the worst of each storm's impact, leaving the inner cabin to deal with gentler conditions. By early December, telegraph operators were spreading word of unusual weather patterns building across the northern plains. The Farmer's Almanac predicted hard cold, and old-timers who remembered the brutal winters of the 70s began counting their firewood with extra care. A historic cold surge was forming in the Canadian territories, the kind that made grown men count matches and wonder if their preparations would prove sufficient when the mercury dropped to levels that killed the unprepared. Jean Dubé checked his enclosed gallery one more time, testing the door seals and examining the plank joints for gaps that might let killing wind through his defenses. The real test was coming, and every method would face judgment under conditions that separated the wise from the dead. December arrived with the kind of steady cold that tested every joint, every chink, every decision a frontier builder had made during the frantic construction months. Across the St. John River Valley, cabin stoves worked harder against the creeping chill that found its way through walls that had seemed solid in October, but revealed their weaknesses when the mercury dropped and stayed down. Ephraim Cole burned through his split wood faster than expected, feeding his fire every few hours through the night to keep his main room above freezing. His cabin behaved exactly the way frontier cabins had always behaved in hard weather. Heat leaked fastest where air moved fastest, around door frames and window sashes, through gaps where settling logs had opened new cracks. up through loft hatches that never quite sealed tight against the constant draw of rising warm air. Tom Ouellette discovered that his carefully chinked walls still bled warmth during windstorms, when moving air outside created pressure differences that sucked heated air through gaps too small to see but large enough to matter. His children slept closer to the center of the cabin, away from the outer walls where frost formed on the inside logs 3 feet from the fireplace. The standard frontier routine had always been banking the fire at 9 o'clock in the evening, then tending it again around 5 in the morning, but Ouellette found himself rising twice in the night to feed wood into a stove that could not seem to get ahead of the cold that pressed against his walls with relentless persistence. The Dubé cabin told a different story. Jean's enclosed gallery had become the family's winter workplace, a buffer zone where Marie could split kindling, scrape boots clean, sharpen tools, and handle all the daily tasks that normally meant opening the main door and dumping frigid air directly into their heated living space. The ring maintained its own temperature somewhere between the bitter outside air and the warmth of the interior, not comfortable like sitting by the fire, but manageable for work that required steady hands and clear thinking. When she moved from the gallery into the main cabin, the temperature difference was gentle rather than shocking, a graduated transition that kept the inner space stable. Father Lefebvre made his rounds through the settlement on the coldest January nights, checking on families and noting in his parish records which households were managing the winter well and which ones were burning through their fuel supplies too quickly. The priest had seen enough hard seasons to recognize the signs of trouble: children with persistent coughs from sleeping in rooms that dropped too cold, parents who looked worn down from tending fires that never quite won their battle against drafts and heat loss, families already rationing their split wood in January when February and March lay ahead like a frozen siege. But when Father Lefebvre visited the Dubé household, he found something that contradicted his experience of frontier winters. The main cabin stayed consistently warmer with what appeared to be less fuel consumption. Jean's stove ran steadier, maintaining more even temperatures without the desperate feeding of wood that characterized most valley homes during the deep cold spells. The children played on floor areas that stayed comfortable even during windstorms that had other families huddled directly around their heating sources. Ephraim Cole began paying closer attention to the smoke rising from Dubé's chimney during the worst weather. His neighbor's fire burned with the steady rhythm of a well-managed heating system, rather than the frantic consumption that marked cabins losing their battle against the elements. Cole's own stove seemed to burn harder, but heat less during blow weather, as if the wind was pulling warmth straight up his chimney and forcing cold air in through cracks he could not locate or seal. His main room temperatures dropped into the 30s on the worst nights, despite constant attention to his fire and careful banking of coals that should have carried heat until morning. The enclosed gallery was demonstrating principles that most frontier builders had never considered. Moving air was the enemy of stable temperatures. It stripped heat from any surface it touched and created pressure differences that turned the smallest gaps into pathways for heat loss. Still air, by contrast, was insulation itself, creating a barrier that slowed the transfer of heat from warm spaces to cold ones. Dubé's ring killed wind pressure before it could attack the cabin logs, and the dead airspace it created borrowed enough heat through the inner walls to maintain temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside conditions. Marie tracked the practical benefits with the attention to detail that kept frontier families alive through resource management and careful observation. Their firewood consumption was running 30 to 40% less than the same period the previous winter, measured in counted armloads carried across the threshold and stacked beside their stove. The difference was significant enough to matter when every cord of split wood represented days of labor and months of drying time. More importantly, the cabin's interior temperatures stayed in the 50 to 55 degree range during the night hours when other valley homes were slipping into the 30s and threatening the safety of sleeping children. Tom Ouellette noticed that his own family coughed more during the raw nights when cold air seemed to creep across his floor, no matter how carefully he tended his fire. The Dubé children, by contrast, appeared healthier through the deep winter months, sleeping comfortably in conditions that would have left other youngsters shivering under extra blankets and waking with the kind of persistent chest congestion that worried parents and marked the difference between cabins that worked and those that merely provided shelter. By late January, telegraph operators were carrying increasingly urgent weather reports from stations across the Northern Territories. The language was measured but ominous, an Arctic outbreak of unusual intensity building across the Canadian plains, with temperatures and wind conditions that promised to test every structure and every survival method across a region stretching from the Dakotas to the Maritime provinces. Old-timers who remembered the killing winters of the 1870s began double-checking their fuel supplies and reviewing their emergency procedures with the gravity of men who understood that some weather events separated the living from the dead based on margins as thin as a few degrees of interior temperature or a few extra cords of split wood. The historic cold surge was coming, and every method would face judgment, under conditions that had no patience for building techniques that looked adequate but failed when the mercury dropped to levels that made survival itself the only measure of success. February 11, 1899, brought the kind of weather that turned the entire eastern seaboard into a testing ground for every building method, every heating system, every survival preparation that frontier families had trusted with their lives. The Great Arctic outbreak swept down from the Canadian territories with temperatures that dropped below zero across vast stretches of the continent, driving wind that found every weakness in human construction and exploited it without mercy. Telegraph lines carried reports of record cold from Minnesota to Maine, and weather stations that had operated for decades recorded temperatures that challenged their instruments and their understanding of what winter could accomplish when Arctic air masses moved with the persistence of geological forces. The St. John River Valley felt the assault as a living pressure that seemed to test each cabin, each chimney, each decision about materials and methods that had been made during the distant warmth of summer building seasons. Wind attacked the settlement with the focused intensity of something hunting for weakness, finding every crack in log construction, every gap around door frames, every place where chinking had shrunk or mortar had failed. The sound was constant and penetrating, a howl that seemed to come from every direction at once, punctuated by the sharp reports of timber contracting under stress and the whistle of air being forced through openings too small to see, but large enough to matter when the temperature difference between inside and outside reached 40 degrees or more. Ephraim Cole's cabin began losing its battle against the cold by the second night of the outbreak. His stove, fed constantly with split wood that represented weeks of labor, could not outrun the heat loss that accelerated with every degree the outside temperature dropped. His main room, which had maintained 50 degrees during ordinary winter weather, slipped into the 40s despite his best efforts to seal gaps and maintain a hot fire. His bedroom, separated from the heating source by a thin partition wall, became unsafe for his children as temperatures dropped toward freezing and stayed there despite blankets piled 3 deep and shared body heat that had always been sufficient during normal cold spells. Tom Ouellette faced the same mathematics of survival that had killed frontier families for generations: fuel consumption that exceeded supply, heat loss that exceeded production, and interior temperatures that dropped below the threshold where human bodies could maintain warmth through the night hours when fires burned lowest. His water bucket froze solid despite being kept near his stove, and frost formed on the inside walls of his cabin in patterns that showed exactly where pressure was forcing cold air through his construction. His family gathered in the main room, abandoning their separate sleeping spaces for the collective warmth that concentrated around their heating source. But even there, the floor temperatures dropped low enough to numb feet and make sleep fitful and dangerous. Jean Dubé's enclosed gallery faced the same Arctic assault, but distributed its effects across a system designed to absorb and dissipate the attack before it reached the heated core. Drifting snow piled against the outer plank wall of his ring, creating an additional insulation barrier rather than pressing directly against the cabin logs, where it could conduct cold through the timber and create ice formations that would persist until spring. The gallery structure itself took the direct impact of wind pressure, flexing and creaking under the load, but protecting the inner cabin from the full force of conditions that were dismantling less protected structures across the valley. Inside the ring, the air remained still and measurably warmer than the outside conditions. The buffer zone was not comfortable. It was too cold for extended work without heavy clothing, but it was survivable for the daily tasks that kept a household functioning during a siege that might last for days. Marie could tend to necessary chores without opening the main cabin door, preserving the interior temperature that represented the difference between safety and danger for her family. The graduated temperature system meant that heat was not lost in sudden bursts every time human activity required movement between spaces. Father Lefebvre made his emergency rounds on the worst night of the outbreak, checking on families whose survival might depend on assistance from neighbors or temporary shelter in structures that were proving more resilient than others. The priest carried 2 thermometers, simple mercury instruments that registered temperature without bias or hope because he had learned that survival decisions required accurate information rather than optimistic estimates. His measurements told a story that contradicted everything the settlement had believed about heating and insulation methods. At Tom Ouellette's cabin, the interior temperature registered 31 degrees at 10 o'clock in the evening, despite a fire that was consuming wood faster than sustainable and filling the room with smoke from a chimney that was not drawing properly in the extreme conditions. At Ephraim Cole's home, similar readings showed interior temperatures in the low 30s, with children who were showing signs of genuine cold stress, and parents who were burning furniture to supplement their dwindling fuel supplies. The thermometer reading inside Jean Dubé's main cabin showed 53 degrees at the same hour, under the same outside conditions, with a fire that was burning steadily, but not desperately. The difference was 22 degrees, a margin that represented the boundary between survival and catastrophe when Arctic conditions persisted for multiple days and nights. The measurement was not theoretical or approximate. Mercury and glass tubes recorded the physical reality of what different construction methods could accomplish when tested by weather that had no interest in human intentions or conventional wisdom. By morning, the Ouellette and Cole families had moved into the Dubé cabin, carrying blankets and children across the frozen settlement road to shelter that was proving capable of protecting more people than just its builders. The refuge was practical rather than heroic. Frontier communities had always shared resources during emergencies, but the demonstration was undeniable. One construction method had succeeded where others were failing, and the margin of success was measurable in degrees of temperature that separated warmth from freezing, safety from danger, survival from death. The same men who had mocked the enclosed gallery stood in the protected ring on the morning after the worst night, their hands pressed against the plank wall that had taken the full assault of conditions that were disabling standard cabin construction throughout the valley. They could feel the truth through their palms. The wind had died out here, broken against a barrier that had seemed wasteful in summer, but proved essential when winter arrived, with the kind of intensity that tested every assumption about what worked and what failed, when survival itself became the only measure of success. Spring thaw in 1899 revealed the evidence written across the St. John River Valley in patterns of ice damage, drift lines, and structural stress that told the story of which building methods had survived the great Arctic outbreak and which had failed under conditions that pushed every frontier technique to its breaking point. Ephraim Cole's cabin showed the scars of a winter that had nearly killed his family, ice formations on interiors, walls where condensation had frozen and refrozen, cracks in his chinking where extreme temperature changes had caused materials to contract and expand beyond their limits, and worn areas around his stove where desperate fuel feeding had left burns and gouges in floorboards that had once been smooth and level. Tom Ouellette walked the settlement road in April, counting the damage that marked the difference between cabins that had maintained their integrity through the killing cold and those that would require major repairs before the next winter season. His own home needed new chinking in a dozen places where the Arctic assault had found weaknesses and exploited them, plus replacement boards where ice buildup had split timber and created gaps that would leak heat the moment cold weather returned. The mathematical reality was stark. Repairs would consume most of his summer building time and a significant portion of his limited cash resources for materials that should have lasted for years. Jean Dubé spent the early spring days examining his enclosed gallery system with the careful attention of a craftsman evaluating a method that had proven itself under the most extreme conditions his region could produce. The outer plank wall showed expected wear from wind and ice, but no structural damage that would require replacement or major repair. The drift patterns around his cabin revealed how effectively the gallery had distributed snow loads and wind pressure, creating buffer zones that had protected his main structure from the direct assault that had damaged less protected buildings throughout the valley. But Dubé did not gloat over his vindication or claim superior wisdom over neighbors who had questioned his methods. Instead, he began teaching, sharing the specific measurements and construction details that had made the difference between success and failure when the mercury dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. He showed Tom Ouellette how to calculate post spacing for gallery construction, 8-foot centers that were stout enough to handle snow loads and resist the racking forces that could twist inadequately braced walls during windstorms. He demonstrated the nail patterns that held vertical planking secure without creating stress points that would fail when timber contracted under extreme cold. Marie Dubé documented the practical benefits with the precision that marked successful frontier resource management. Their firewood consumption through the brutal winter had been several cords less than comparable families, represented in stacked rows that showed the real-world savings achieved through construction methods that reduced heat loss rather than simply increasing heat production. The difference was significant enough to matter, not just in labor saved during the cutting and splitting season, but in forest resources that could be preserved for future years when fuel demands might be even greater. Father Lefebvre noted in his parish records that the enclosed gallery method was spreading through the valley community with the rapid adoption that marked genuinely superior techniques rather than mere innovations. 3 families began adding partial enclosures to their existing cabins during the summer of 1899, creating windbreak systems that followed Dubé's principles even when they could not afford to build complete wraparound galleries. 2 more households planned full gallery construction for their next building projects, having seen the measured results that 22 degrees of interior temperature difference could produce when survival itself depended on heating efficiency. Tom Ouellette became the most dedicated student of the method, asking detailed questions about corner bracing, drainage systems, and seasonal assembly techniques that would allow him to winterize his gallery each November and strip it back to open platform configuration each spring. The approach appealed to his practical nature, additional protection when needed, reduced maintenance burden when conditions were mild, and construction costs that could be managed through careful material selection and staged building schedules that spread expenses across multiple seasons. The technical transfer happened through direct demonstration rather than theoretical explanation. Dubé showed, rather than described, how to frame gallery posts with diagonal bracing that distributed wind loads across the entire structure rather than concentrating stress at individual connection points. He walked through the door, cutting and sealing process that created an effective airlock system, explaining how the enclosed ring worked as a tambour entry scaled up from protecting one doorway to sheltering every wall of the heated structure. Young builders like the newly married François Bouchard began incorporating gallery planning into their cabin designs before they started construction, understanding that retrofitting wind protection was always more expensive and less effective than building the system from the foundation up. The method was becoming regionalized, adapted to local materials and building traditions while maintaining the core principle that still air was insulation and that wind pressure could be managed rather than simply endured. By the winter of 1900, the St. John River Valley settlement showed clear evidence of the enclosed gallery influence. Not every family had built complete wraparound systems, but most had added some form of windbreak construction that followed Dubé's logic, extended entries, covered work areas, and staging spaces that buffered their heated cores from direct weather assault. The modifications ranged from simple lean-to additions that protected main doorways to full gallery rings that replicated Dubé's original design. The long-term impact was measured in firewood consumption, interior temperature stability, and family health through the winter months that had always been the most dangerous period in frontier life. Children coughed less in cabins that maintained consistent temperatures. Parents slept better when heating systems worked efficiently rather than desperately. Communities grew stronger when individual households could survive extreme weather without requiring emergency assistance that strained collective resources. Father Lefebvre's final assessment, written in his 1899 parish summary, captured the essence of what had happened. Practical wisdom had been tested under extreme conditions and proven superior to conventional methods through measurable results rather than theoretical arguments. The enclosed gallery was not innovation for its own sake, but adaptation of traditional knowledge to frontier conditions that demanded every advantage human ingenuity could provide. On the frontier, the smartest insulation was often just giving the wind a place to die before it reached your walls. The principle was simple enough for any builder to understand and effective enough to save lives when winter arrived, with the kind of intensity that separated the wise from the dead through margins as thin as 22 degrees of interior warmth.